I'm so pleased to welcome back our guests today. Roddy Doyle is widely praised for his marvelous and bloody brilliant novels, plays, and books for children. Of his 27 works of fiction and nonfiction, his beloved Barrytown novels were critical darlings and were subsequently adapted into a series of successful films. And in 1993, his novel, Paddy, Clarke, Ha Ha Ha, won the prestigious Booker Prize. There are so many more of Roddy's terrific books to acknowledge, but time is short, so we'll skip ahead to Love, an elegiac yet wonderfully humorous tale of two old drinking buddies who revisit the Dublin pubs and poignant pains of their youth. Today, Roddy will be in conversation with Liz Moore, the best-selling author of Long, Bright River and The Unseen World. Liz and Roddy, the screen is all yours.
Thanks so much, Andy. And hi, Roddy. It's good to see you virtually. For those at home, Roddy, I first met Roddy when he was a professor of mine. I think you were a visiting professor, Roddy, at Barnard College when I was an undergraduate there. And he was a wonderful teacher and professor, for the record. And we've stayed in touch just a bit over the years. And most recently, we saw each other for lunch in January when I was on tour in England and Ireland. And I told him when we connected over email prior to this event that it felt a little bit like being a time traveler with sort of very bad news about the future, because I hadn't spoken to him since then. So Roddy, I'm going to talk to you, ask you a lot of questions about a lot of things, including what this period of your life is like. But first, I'll ask you, I suppose, to introduce the book, which I also adored, and read a bit from it, and then we'll move into a conversation, if that's all right.
Sure, yeah. It's getting dark in here in this room because it's 10 p.m.
That's great.
I don't have a bulb. I've only got a small light. I didn't realize daylight is because we're that bit further north than you are. At this time of year, there's only about 4 hours of darkness, so I wasn't anticipating that it would actually get a bit dim. But I'll do my best.
Okay.
Essentially, the book is a conversation, a night-long conversation between two men hitting 60 who know each other, but more importantly, really knew each other when they were in their early 20s. And they discovered the world of the Dublin pub or pubs together. And I suppose for a couple of years, but particularly for a few months, it's almost true to say that they were essentially the same person. It's almost they shared a psyche. And they've kept in touch. One of them has emigrated. He comes home, the narrator, comes home now and again, a couple of times a year to visit his father. And they get together. They used to go drinking. Now they meet for something to eat. They exchange information about their families, promptly forget it. They don't have much interest in each other's families, really. They meet out of habit as much as anything else. And but this one night, Joe, Davy is the narrator, and Joe is this other friend of his, drops a piece of information or a piece of news on the table, and they end up going to a pub and another pub and another pub. And so it's about these two men, I think, in a way, trying to reclaim an old friendship. And there's a sense during the book that this is either going to be the very last time they meet or the beginning of something fresh, really, not just an old friendship that's kept alive, but something really new. And so I'll read the first few pages, Liz. That'll probably be the easiest thing to do.
Sounds great.
Okay. He knew it was her, he told me. He told me this a year after he saw her. Exactly a year, he said. Exactly a year. That's what I said, Davy, a year ago, yesterday. You remember the date? I do, yeah. Jesus, Joe. He saw her at the end of a corridor, and he knew immediately. She was exactly the same, even from that far off, even though she was only a shape, a dark, slim shape, a silhouette in the center of the late afternoon light that filled the glass door behind her. She was never slim, I said. He shrugged. I don't even know what slim means, really, he said. He smiled. Same here, I said. I just said it, he said. The word. She was a tall shape instead. Okay, not a roundy shape. She's aged well, I said. That's what you're telling me. I am, he said, and she has. Where was the corridor? I asked him. The school, he said. What school? The school, he said again. We didn't know her in school, I said. I knew he didn't mean the school we'd both gone to. We'd known each other that long. I'd said that we hadn't known her in school to try and get him to be himself, to give back an answer that would get us laughing. He was the funny one. My kid's school, he said. Hang on, I said. It was a parent-teacher meeting. Yeah. The woman of your dreams stepped out of the sun and into a parent-teacher meeting. Yep. 30 years after the last time you saw her, I said. More, actually, way more, 36 or 7 years. Yeah, he said, that's it, more or less. What did you say there? That she stepped out of the sun? I think so, yeah. Well, that's it, he said. That's what happened. She did. I didn't live in Ireland. I went over to Dublin 3 or 4 times a year to see my father. I used to bring my family, but in more recent years I'd travelled alone. The kids were grown up and gone, and my wife Faye didn't like flying, and she wasn't keen on the drive to Holyhead and the ferry. Your father never liked me, so he didn't. He did not, she said. He thought I was a slut. He said it, sure. He didn't say that. More or less he did. You told me that yourself, remember? I'm not making it up. He never liked me, so I won't be going around pretending I like him. I hate that house. It's miserable. She kissed me, Joe said now. In the school. A man I knew, I thought I knew, I used to know, would have answered no in the arse or something like that. Yes, he said. She remembered me. I didn't know Joe well. I used to.
Wonderful. Thank you. So now I'd like to ask you, what has your, in a serious way, what has your experience of this time been like since I last saw you? Are you all right? Is your family all right? Everybody okay? I assume Dublin was and perhaps is under quarantine, just as...
all the travel restrictions are being lifted after this weekend. So at the moment I could travel 20 kilometers from home. A few weeks ago it was 5 kilometers, and then for about 2.5 months it was 2 kilometers. So it was a lockdown. Hasn't been really, compared to some places and compared to the situation of some people. I personally have had quite an easy time in that my children are all adults, so there's not the anxiety or the homeschooling. I've managed to evade that. I've never...
You're lucky.
Google homeschooling really quickly. And also, it seems like a dark thing to say, but both of my parents are dead. So I didn't have the anxiety of worrying about them.
Sure.
That's like a strange thing to say, but they were very elderly when they died. They were 90 and 92, and they died under much more gentle circumstances, shall we say.
Sure.
They died when their time had come. So I didn't have that anxiety. And at a facile level, I've been working alone for 27 years. I work in the house. My office is up above me here. So at that level, nothing changed. But of course, when you stop then and you say, well, everything changed. I had started a novel, for example, that I put aside because I was writing it in the present tense, but actually I didn't know what that meant for a long time. I'm not sure I still do. There was that hysteria in the first weeks, and we were told to expect a surge. Our Prime Minister, our Taoiseach, he was very, very good, very clear, but he told us there would be a surge. He made a speech on St. Patrick's Day. And, the word surge carries a certain drama, so we waited. But the population generally were very compliant, and the figures went down, down, down. So a lot of what I had planned this year, my book, which luckily now is out in the USA, was supposed to be out here in May, and that's been postponed. I had a play going to tour Ireland and then the United States. That's been cancelled. Another play or a musical postponed for at least a year, and a brand new play that was going to go on the stage here at Christmas postponed. So the whole working year is gone, and everything I was writing about is gone. And I haven't said that. There's plenty to write about. It's just that my working day, my working week, my working year bears no resemblance to what I had anticipated. So, which now doesn't feel like a bad thing, but say if we were talking about 6 weeks ago, I probably would have been more despondent. Because
so much has changed.
Yeah, so much has changed. And, you know, now and again, the writers, I live in a small country as well, and you know, if you can have something big, shall we say, and one of the theatrical productions is a musical based on my first book, The Commitments, and it was going to tour Ireland and the UK for about 10 months. That would really allow me to work on a novel for quite a while without being under any pressure. So I just have to adjust to circumstances, and now I feel fine about it.
It's interesting. I promise to everyone who's watching that we're about to move into a conversation about love in 1 second, but I'm finding it interesting to catch up and hear how your work has changed. So I'm going to stay there for just a minute. I was having a conversation with my editor where I had the same feeling as you. The novel I was working on felt suddenly irrelevant. And I'm still struggling with that feeling. And I wonder, in your estimation, is it the right move to acknowledge the fact that the world has so fundamentally changed in one's fiction, or to sort of nod to it? Or should we sort of, or do you dread the idea of like 2,000 pandemic novels coming out all together in 2 years? Which is the right way forward? I need help too.
We're going to have an awful lot of monologues.
Yep. Alone in a room.
You can't beat a good monologue, but
That's
not
right.
That's right. And I suspect that we're going to get a lot of novels. I'd say I'm about ready to go back into the novel, because I think I have a stronger sense of the present day, and actually the shifts and the change could become part of it. But I've been writing short stories. I finished one and sent it off, and waiting for the rejection, and I'm working on 2 others that are very, very different. And I think short stories seem to me to be a way of capturing moments in this time, you know, as opposed to trying to capture the big picture. I've written, I think 3 of the novels I've written have involved a year in the life of a character, and I've spent that year following the character. I don't think this is the time I'd want to do something like that. And I noticed as well that the way I'm working has changed. I'm working in short bursts. I'm probably still as productive as I have been, but I'm not sitting at my desk for hours worrying a sentence and moving on to the next one. I'm putting in about an hour and a half, and then stopping for a while, and then doing something else. And I'm lucky, because just before the pandemic, I kind of signed up to do what might be a TV series, you know, about a talking dog, which has no sense whatsoever. I've written about talking dogs in my children's books, you know, so I'm a veteran of the talking dog. Where, you know, the surprise is the dogs don't talk, actually. But that allows me a lovely escape, you know, once I go into that world.
Great. Well, allow me. Can I turn this into a conversation of the book that we're here to discuss, if I have to? I realize that I'm holding a different cover than those of us in the US will have. This must be the Irish and English edition, right? So Roddy has the American cover. I loved this book, and one of the reasons I loved it so much was because it offered me an escape. This might speak to what we were just discussing, because I miss the act of socializing in groups of friends and family in an indoor space where the physical presence of others is an important part of the interaction. And if this book is about so many things, but one of the most important is the act of socializing with an old friend about whom one has mixed feelings, but just all the noticing of physical gestures and physical touch, even between men, between women, was so, I found it so profoundly and unexpectedly moving because all of that had been taken away. So thank you for letting me live in those moments just for a bit during this strange season of life. I'm wondering, do you find yourself missing that physical? Do you have a ritual of meeting friends in pubs in your normal life? And are you reproducing that over Zoom or things, or in parks, or how are you meeting friends or socializing if you are?
Zoom is a sad, sad response to the absence of social contact. There's been an open arrangement between myself and friends, which started soon after we left high school, which is going back to the mid-70s. And we meet on Thursday nights. There's 3 of us meet. And, well, that stopped. But we meet on Zoom at the same time. And I mean, it's extraordinary, really, when you're in a pub and, you know, there are people all around you and there's the hum of noise and perhaps there's a TV on with football in the corner or something, or you got the traffic outside or whatever. But when people stop talking, when close friends stop talking, it's fine. Whereas on Zoom, when we stop talking,
it's terrible.
It's awful.
Yeah.
Sounds, do I know these men at all? And of course I do. And we end up just talking about TV series that, you know.
It's the new weather, talking about TV.
Yeah, the temptation to make up something that doesn't actually exist is very strong.
That's great.
But, I met a friend of mine, and we met because the weather here has been very, very good, and we were able to meet in a park and just have a coffee. And for a few hours, normally we'd be in a pub, you know, but we were able to just sit on the grass and have a cup of coffee. And then last Saturday, I went to somebody's home from around the corner. That was a strange experience, going into somebody else's house. We're allowed, you know, it wasn't breaking any law. Yeah. But the woman of the house, so to speak, she opened the door and said, you know, big smile, come on in. And I expected her to get out of the way, you know, so I could
dodge around her.
Distance. But of course, you know, the front door isn't 2 meters wide.
Sure, yeah. There's only so much.
The window, that wasn't an option.
Yeah.
It felt very strange to be in somebody else's house.
Isn't that amazing? Yeah.
Yeah. I felt, am I allowed to sit here? Am I allowed to put my hands on the table? This is somebody else's fork. Should I not have? No. Yep. But having said that, that was great, and it felt like another little step towards.
It is sort of like everything was taken away, and now as one little thing after another is introduced, there's a new sense of gratitude for it, which I guess is something. Yeah. But speaking of sort of physical spaces, obviously your books are famous for being largely set in Dublin, which, am I correct? I know you live there, and I believe you were born and raised there too. Is that correct? Yeah. So I want to talk about the 2 different ways that Dublin is portrayed in Love, which I thought was really interesting. And if you will forgive me, I'm going to read a passage that I picked out in my American accent. Here, so this is the narrator, Davy, speaking about coming into Dublin when he was younger, I believe in the 1980s, and experiencing the thrill of being seen as an adult in a pub setting for the first time. These would be our people now, and this was still our future, with or without the woman. We were laughing again, chatting, soaking in it. I could feel myself melting. It was good, flowing slowly into the noise, the accents, the jokes, the stories, the geography, listening, hoping someone would say something to me, male, female, a way in, the start. It was why we'd been coming into town, to make the break, to live up somehow to the music we loved, the books we read, to walk streets instead of roads, cross a real river, sit in the pubs that Bean and Flann O'Brien had sat in. And yet later on in the book, a different character sort of derides London as only the capital of Ireland, and that's nothing to be stuck up about. So you have these 2 conflicting visions of the city. And I'm curious, when you were growing up, I understand that you're different in your autobiography than Davy and Joe are, having grown up right in the city. But how did you perceive Dublin as a city? Did you see it as a sort of cosmopolitan place that was so famously and beautifully represented in wonderful literature, or did you just sort of see it as home?
Oh, primarily home, and I still do. I was 16 when I read Flann O'Brien's novel, Let's Swim Two Birds. I read him before I read Joyce. And I don't think I'd read anything else. There was a wonderful book called The Countrywoman by a writer called Paul Smith. I hope it's still in print. And it's set in what we call the slums or the tenements of Dublin. And I'd read that, I think, when I was about 14 or 15. I suppose it's a bit melodramatic, but brilliantly written, you know. But it was Flann O'Brien, reading him at the age of about 16. The way he put the Dublin accent on paper, I just found hilarious. And then I suppose it changed then really from just being home to being something a bit extra, you know. And I read Dubliners possibly when I was 17, I think, those short stories. And again, there was a strong sense, oh, I know that street, you know, and this fictional character walked down that street. And then, so gradually, I suppose I had a stronger sense of Dublin's place in literature. But of course, you know, how many books a year do we read, even those of us who are really well read? If you're going to say, I know Irish literature, you know some, and it's going to take you most of your life to read it, you know. So I was never fixated on Dublin as a literary, as part of the literary stew, so to speak. But when I started writing myself, the first efforts were pretty feeble and pretty awful because I was straying away from the parish, I suppose, in some ways, or straying away from, you know, the way they say, write what you know. I think it's a crummy piece of advice if it's taken literally. But on the other hand, you do need to choose the right words, you do need to feel fairly close to what you're writing about, you know, you're making it up. And so that's why I began to write about the area outside my front door. And the first books then were set. I made this name up, Fictional Suburb. It was terrific, one of the good decisions I made back then. You know, I don't remember it feeling like a big decision, but it actually was to create a fictional suburb in a real city, Barrytown. It was a Steely Dan song on their album Pretzel Logic. So, and it sounds very Irish. So I made this place Barrytown. And so it allowed me the freedom to invent anything I wanted. And I just, you know, ripped the map of Dublin and planted Barrytown there, and it became part of Dublin. So I had, in many ways, the best of both worlds there, you know. Well, I think I've used the ice analogy before, you know, midwinter and you're going to cross a river or a lake and you're hoping that the ice will support you. And, you know, when you set off to write a novel, Liz, you know, you're walking across ice really, and you're hoping to get to the other side. And writing about Dublin allows me the confidence that I'm on reasonably thick ice, and I will get, you know, when a character my age certainly starts speaking, I know how they're going to speak. When a woman the same age, you know, or 20 years either side of my age speaks, I know I don't have to think too much about how she'll speak. A young character, by young 30, you know, 20, I have to give it thought. But I don't have to think about it too much because it's in my head. You know, I hear these voices all the time. You've been to Dublin, and you know, people talk all the time. You know, so that's why I stay close to home. Really, in terms of, you know, as a human being, I like living in Dublin, but as a writer, you know, the option is always there to move, and it's an attractive one in many, many ways. But I think I'd probably be cutting myself off from an awful lot.
It's interesting because the first place I met you was in New York, where I suppose you must have lived for, was it a year? Was that a visiting?
No, a semester. I never thought in a college, actually. That was my one and only experience.
That's interesting. Well, I'm happy that it happened when I happened to be there.
It was great.
Yeah. So I have certainly kind of connections between you and New York in my head, but of course Dublin is really home. I'm wondering too, one of the things that I was most taken by in this book was its structure. And in this book, it's set in the present over the course of one night, over the course of mainly one pub, but other pubs as well. And yet also we learn a great deal about both central figures' pasts, the narrator through his own recollections of his past, and Joe through dialogue, his friend in the pub with him through dialogue. And we move kind of seamlessly between past and present, and multiple moments from the past and the present. There's no chapter designations that separate the past and the present. And I thought that was so beautifully done and really kind of meditative and transportive. And it ended up feeling a lot like I was in a dream state. And in the book, you actually talk quite a bit about the feeling of this. I'm going to read another little line. It said, at one point, one character says, I felt that way when I saw her in the school, Jessica. This is the woman they both loved were attracted to in their past, whom one has linked up with in the present. The time when I saw her coming down the corridor, I wasn't surprised, like there'd been no gap, no years in between. And listen, I'm not adding a gloss to it, significance or something after the fact, but I know as well, it happens. It's happened to me, the head playing tricks, the light in a room or something. I don't know though. I don't mean nostalgia or the other one, deja vu. And Davy says, I know what you mean. Go on. It's like waking up a bit, as if your real living has been the dream. And it was suddenly so clear to me that the trick of this book and the kind of part of its brilliance is that its structure illustrates one of its central themes so beautifully. And I always am moved when I come to a moment in a book where I realize that the author, either with intention or by virtue of just a great deal of instinct, has caused the structure of the book to reflect really what it's all about. So I ask you, that's a long-winded way of asking, when did the structure arrive to you? And is it something from page one, the day one of writing this book, you knew would be the case, or did you sort of find it more slowly than that?
Generally, I knew, not in a kind of blow by blow or link by link way, but I knew the structure wasn't going to be linear. And I knew I'd have to work it out in a formal way when I got to the end of the first draft. And I knew that there'd be holes in the story and repetitions that I didn't want. But I had done something a little bit similar when I wrote my novel, Paddy, Clarke, when I was a much younger man. I think I was 31 perhaps, or 2 when I started that book. And because of the circumstances of my life, I had a baby in the house, followed by another one. And I was teaching in a high school full time. I was grabbing moments and writing little bits and gradually getting to know the character. And the first draft was an utter mess. And I printed it out and put it on the floor in my office and began to gather up bits of paper and decide, well, they go together and they go together. And that, I've got the beginning here and now the next bit and the next bit, and there's something big missing here. I have to write that, but I'll go on to this. So I gradually, trial and error, began to rearrange the pages. And I did the exact same with the novel, The Woman Who Walked Into Doors. And I ended up realizing that there's 3 tracks to the story: the narrator's present, her recent past, and her distant past. And the trick was to try and tell the stories at the same time. And I knew relatively early on, when I wrote the first draft of this novel, Love, really quickly, very, very quickly. It only took about 3-4 months, which is really quick for me. But I spent about a year editing it then. And again, I printed it out, got down on the floor, had said, well, I'm definitely starting it with this piece here. I need then a bit more here. And gradually, came up with the structure and wrote out, if you like, a skeleton shape, and examined it and decided, yes, that's broadly what it should be like. But There were a few chapters, for example, I wanted short chapters, short, intimate chapters between Davy and his wife, to capture the complexity of a relationship that goes into it 4 decades, you know. And I think, in a way, as I get older, as we do get older, you know, there's an awful, we're carrying a lot of life with us now, you know, and we're not striding forward into any type of a career, although I'm always thinking about the next piece of work, but the ambitions are different. And, you know, my children are adults, you know, so that aspect of my life in a way is finished. So you bring all this stuff with you, and it becomes the thing that I want to not necessarily write about in an autobiographical way, but to try and assemble it to make a fuller story, to use my age, if you like, as a good creative thing, as opposed to something that one would rather not have to endure. You know?
Absolutely, yeah.
Funny, the style. So even though a lot of the book is about 2 young men, I don't think the book could have been written by a young man. Certainly not me when I was a young man. I have to be more or less the age I am now to think in the way that created the book, really.
Sure.
So in a way, I wanted to make it, you know, that was my 12th novel, and I've written stories. I've got a lot of work under my belt, so to speak. And I have to make sure that every time I begin a novel that I want to do it, and that it's going to be a bit different, and there's a challenge there, whether in the research or the style or the subject matter I know nothing about or little about, and I have to, you know, think a lot about it. So I need that energy if I'm going to work. So this time round, the energy really was in trying to tell a story that somehow encapsulated the whole lives of these 2 men, particularly the narrator, and not just the evening. You know, that it wouldn't be just a trip down memory lane, so to speak, which I would have found quite tedious.
They also, Davy at one point I remember says like, all right, this is boring. I'm bored now by you know, Joe's relating of his the very long relating of his the story of him and Jessica, which I thought was funny.
The more you drink, the longer it gets.
Exactly, you know? Yeah.
The enjoyment. I did enjoy trying to capture their drunken state as they kind of revert former versions of themselves, wrinkled youths, you know, and also they take back the accents that they have dropped really as they've gone up a couple of rungs in the social ladder. And of course, Davy has spent more of his adult life, much more of his life in the UK than he has done in Ireland. So he kind of reclaims the Dublin accent. And I didn't want it to be too glaringly obvious, but I did a lot of experimentation. But I think if they'd been sober, there are 2 things. If they'd been sober, it would have been a much shorter book, because either they wouldn't have got to the point at all, or they'd have got there much sooner. And I think if they were younger men, perhaps they'd have been more confident talking about their feelings, perhaps. That might be just wishful thinking on my part. But these are 2 men who don't talk about their feelings, and yet they have to.
That brings me to my next question, which is about male friendship, which is certainly a subject that you've written about. But I will say you've written really wonderfully about women in your career too, and have had at least a couple of books that I've read that center in which the protagonist is a woman. So, you know, I know people, for some reason, you know, I was reading sort of reviews of this book in prep, which were excellent, by the way, in preparation for this conversation. And I noticed how many people sort of discuss you as somebody who writes primarily about the world of men, maybe just because this book is about 2 men. And yet I thought to myself about all the really lovely female characters I've read from you over the years. And I disagreed with that assessment, for the record. But anyway, this book, it does center that its 2 protagonists are men. And it's a book about male friendship. And it's also, as we come to find out toward the end, really a book about fathers and sons. And I wondered, as you have, over the course of your career, do you think you're writing about male relationships, either male friendships or male familial relationships, has changed? Do you think that men today are better equipped to share certain emotions that they wouldn't have been in the 1980s, for example? Or do you not, am I reaching there with that?
No, my answer to that would be, I hope so.
Yeah.
You know, my father, my parents were really nice people.
Mm-hmm.
They were nice, they were kind, they were funny. It was a nice house, warm house to grow up in.
Mm-hmm.
Never once, ever, in the years I lived in that house, did they talk about sex.
Mm-hmm.
Ever.
Sure.
Never mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
House full of children, but, you know.
Sure.
It happened miraculously.
Sure.
They loved each other, I think. They held hands in even when they were both retired and they'd be walking along the seafront here in Dublin. People used to comment on the fact that there was this elderly couple who held hands while they were walking, yet they never spoke about intimacy.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I knew that they loved me and I loved them, but I could probably remember the amount of times I was told that, you know.
Sure.
It just wasn't said. I never doubted it. But I hear now younger people, you know, when they're leaving each other and they're going to have to do without each other's company for 24 hours. It's verging on tragic, and they're saying, "I love you too, love you," you know.
Mm-hmm. Sure.
And I don't want to be smart-arsed about it, but in a way, men of my generation were trained not to have feelings, really, and not to express them.
Sure.
And I think if we take out, the two men it's a male friendship. It's two men, but if we take out if we were to extract the pages where they're talking about three different women, there's not much of the book left.
Sure.
And they don't talk about the women in a salacious way, although obviously they're very attracted to the women they know. But they don't talk salaciously. It's not that. It's, I suppose, the mystery of them, and the fact that they don't really know them or have known them. And but at the same time, clearly they really like these women as opposed to just loving them. They like these women as well. And I think another aspect of it, in terms of the father-son thing, is that it's a strange thing that happens, and I don't know how you'd write about it, really. I suppose eventually I might in a more overt way. But even though my father died 7 years ago and my mother died 3 years ago, or just over 2 years ago, actually. No, I got that wrong. I think it's 3 years. Yeah. I'm actually not sure now. I'm a bit lost. But anyway, relatively recently, it is actually 2 years, 2 and a bit. And I was a few months short of my 60th birthday when she died. So I became, and one of my sisters was a pensioner, my older sister, and the other one. So we were, I think my mother's youngest child at that time was 57, And yet at that age, at the age of 59, I became somehow an orphan.
Sure.
I didn't have parents, And effectively in my day-to-day life, I didn't have parents for years. I didn't need them. They were friends in many, many ways. And, I lived near them and they were great grandparents, but they weren't parents as I would understand parents to be when you were a child or you're a teenager or you're in your 20s or even into your 30s. But something happened when the actual fact of my mother's mortality became a thing, and the funeral, and I had no parents, and there's nobody above me. And that got me thinking, and not just thinking, but feeling in a sense, and for a while I found I was idealizing them, and then gradually they became human again. Sure. And I think that has gone into the work as well. Sure. I've often been intrigued, in recent work I've had quite a lot of the characters have lost parents early in life. In my last novel, Smile, the narrator's father died when he was in school. The narrator at this novel, his mother dies when he's in school. And I'm not altogether sure why. I think maybe it's to make it a bit different from my own circumstances. Yeah. So I don't start falling into some lazy version of my own life, which I've no interest in. Well, I'm living in it, but
Sure.
I've no interest in describing it, you know.
Sure. I have many more questions for you, but I'm going to pause in my own line of questioning because it's time to let other people ask questions too. If anybody has questions, feel free to enter them into that little thing at the bottom of your screen that says ask a question, and I will moderate for Roddy as I receive them. I'm going to ask this one first, Roddy, because I think it's funny. Does Roddy have a dog? What kind, and how vocal is it?
A dog?
Yeah, because you said you were writing a show, I think, about a talking dog. Do you have a dog? What kind, and how vocal is it?
I have two of them.
Okay.
I've a Ruby Cavalier, I think he's called. Mm-hmm. And then I've got a mutt. Mm-hmm. And she is extremely vocal. In fact, I'm quite surprised you didn't hear her about half an hour ago.
I didn't, yeah.
Having a shrill conversation with the next door neighbour's dog.
That's funny.
So you have two dogs. Mm-hmm. It's always there was always a dog in the house when I was a kid. And we've had dogs now, I don't know, here in where we're living, 15 years or so, I suppose. Yeah, great company.
Good.
So yeah, I'm not a doggy person as such, you know. I don't. You do meet these vaguely insane people who.
You don't have an Instagram account for your dogs?
No.
No. Okay. Never too late. Never too late, especially now that we're socially isolated.
But, none of the dogs talk, but the surprise is, you know, I've written a series of books with a talking dog called mm-hmm. Rover, and it was so easy to imagine a dog talking because I think. The surprise is that they don't. And kids, I suspect if a child is young enough and the dog starts talking to the child will not be
right.
At least a bit surprised.
That's right. From Melanie, you're so prolific and have an important platform. How do you decide what topic is worth writing about? Or do you even consider that?
I don't really consider it. I'm not sure if I think about topics when I start. I'm working on a short story at the moment, and really what got me going has dropped away completely. It bears no resemblance to what I thought I might be writing about. Mm-hmm. And also, you know, so I'm always open to that. I don't plan too carefully. I don't plan too meticulously. And I wrote a book called The Woman Who Walked Into Doors, for example, which is narrated by a woman who was in a very violent marriage for a long time, almost 2 decades of her life. But I didn't sit down to write about domestic violence. I decided the important thing is to create a fictional woman who is compelling and interesting enough for the reader to decide to spend whatever, 16, 17 hours in her company as they read the book. And the issue of domestic violence is part of her story, but I didn't, you know, it's the cart before the horse thing. The character is way more interesting than the issue would be. And the job then is to try and do justice to the issue and the person who's living through it or describing it. But I can't think once when I would have sat down to write a book about an issue. The issues inevitably come along, you know. Paddy Clarke, I didn't know Paddy was going to observe his parents' marriage fall apart. I didn't know that when I started. I began to sense it as I got deeper into it, you know. But I didn't know when I started. But I wouldn't have known. I wouldn't have got to that point where I was making decisions if I hadn't started, if that makes sense. Sure. Well, I'm kind of happy just to start filling pages. If I know if after a while I have a vague idea how the book will end, that's really reassuring. I suppose you probably feel the same way, do you?
I do. Yeah, I'm very far from that with this current book that I'm writing, but I'm looking forward to that moment.
Yeah.
And I agree with you about writing about big contemporary issues. I think if you set out with that aim, your characters end up feeling a little bit like paper dolls that you're just sort of maneuvering around the issue. So I agree with you.
Thank you.
Here's a question. Would you talk about the naming of your characters? They're always so apt, and it seems Jessica had to be Jessica in this book.
I don't even know what that means. I don't know. I experiment a bit with names. I know Faye, which is a name I really like now. She wasn't Faye when I started. And I can't remember what she was called.
Sure.
And I'm a bit frightened of naming characters now because I've written short stories and I generally just give the male characters and female characters a first name. They often don't have surnames. And then there's all the novels and all the characters. And at this point, I'm worried that I'm beginning to repeat.
I'm sure. Yeah.
And that's, in reality, that's okay because of, if I had been teaching in a classroom 35 years ago, I don't know, if I'd said Paddy, 3 lads in the room would have said, what? Or the very first class I taught, there were 4 Jacquelines. They were born in the early 60s. It was Jacqueline. So there's no harm in having a few characters called, for example, Holly. But I have noticed that almost automatically now when I have a young character, a teenage kid or a little child, a female, I'm putting down Holly.
That's funny.
I'm not sure. I'm not sure if I know anybody called Holly.
Right.
But so I have to rein it back and think. But I used to use when I began, I used to use the Dublin area phone book.
That's smart.
Younger, if there is anybody young out there watching and listening to what we're saying, it was an actual physical book, and I was living in a bedsit in a large house, very close to where I am now living. And there was a pay phone down in the hall and a phone book beside it. And I used to go down and take the phone book and bring it back up to my room and just flick through to looking for surnames and sometimes, and matching them up. And I recall with my first book coming across in this section for R's, half a column of the surname Rabbit. And I'd heard the name before and I just thought, that's a great name. It's a brilliant name. I like the fact that it's not Irish particularly. And I just decided, well, Jimmy Rabbit. So that's his name, Now there's a pub in Dublin called the Jimmy Rabbit.
That's a huge honor, I'm sure.
It's not a pretty crummy pub.
That's funny.
So the name's trial and error. The phone book doesn't exist anymore, but I do. The rhythm of the name seems to me quite important as well,
Yeah.
But it's big. But if you're writing yourself, the name isn't final until you decide that, So I have changed names quite. Davy wasn't Davy either, the narrator of the novel. This one, Love, wasn't Davy.
Yeah.
Again, I can't remember what his name was.
That's probably for the best. I always am reluctant to give away my trade secrets about things that I've abandoned, like titles of novels that no longer were and things like that. Mm-hmm. Eliana wants to know, what is your favorite pub meal that you might be missing? Do you eat in pubs or mainly drink in pubs?
I hate the smell of food in a pub.
Yeah.
The good pubs in Dublin don't serve food.
Yeah.
In my mind, crisps. Potato chips and peas. No, I don't like the smell of food in the pub. And also, in the world of the pub, in the old-fashioned sense, you want to be with people who are also there for the right reasons, and eating food isn't one of those.
Eating isn't one. My husband, when I first met him, was bar backing on the weekends at a bar in Brooklyn that did only fried food. And when he came back into our apartment, I would make him change at the door because the smell of fried food would otherwise infect our entire apartment for the rest of the week. So I sort of agree with you. Let's see. Your books are very funny, even when, for example, the protagonist has cancer. How are you able to get so much humor into your books?
I don't think I get humor into my book. It's just the way I look at the world, I think, maybe.
Yeah.
I grew up with 2 very funny parents. They were very funny in different ways. Great mimics. Very sharp. Very. They loved language and they loved messing with language. So that's the environment I grew up in. And actually Dublin is a bit like that as well, So I could go pages and pages and pages without the urge to write something that people might find funny because it isn't the right place, you know. But quite often when, you know, the reality is, you know, I don't know if anybody who's with us this evening has been to a funeral in Ireland, but there's a lot of laughter.
Mhm.
And you would have thought it's heartbreaking, it's sad, but there's going to be laughter. Somebody's going to say something that'll get somebody laughing.
Sure.
So it's not a philosophy as such. It's just the way I am. I think it's the way I look at things, and it's I think, say, the woman who walked into doors, for example, she's kind of a funny. She's funny. She's witty in place when she's describing her school days. But there's a great anger in her humor, you know, and so it serves a different purpose, say, to maybe another book does. And the father in The Snapper, Jimmy Rabbit Sr., part of his role is to be the Egypt. He's officially the Egypt in the house. I don't understand this. I don't know what's going on. I don't know. And it's a role he takes on, and it's funny, and they love him for it, you know. And yet he does have this authority as well. So it's kind of he's acting a role. And I think some of the characters do that. But I don't set out to. I mean, I remember reading about Stan Laurel in the editing booth, who would have a stopwatch to make sure there were gags at a certain point, you know, mathematically.
Right.
I've never even given that consideration, you know. If it fits, it fits. If it doesn't, it goes.
Right. From Mark, as Ireland has become much more culturally diverse over the last 20 plus years, has this influenced your writing when developing characters and the voices that you give them?
Yes. Yes and no. Yes, it has. You know, I wrote a collection of stories called The Deportees, which went out of its way. In other words, I went out of my way to introduce, for want of a better term, new Irish characters into Dublin. And very often I thought that my job there was to have a new Irish character, or if you like, an old Irish character, rub shoulders with the new and see how they got on and see what would happen. So yeah, it's something you have to give thought to. I scripted a film that was made 2 years ago called Rosie. And it's about a woman trying to find somewhere for her family to live. And it's set in about 36 hours of her life as she tries to find somewhere to live. And there are scenes, school scenes, when she's collecting the children from school. And you want if you like, you want the kids coming out of the school to reflect what an Irish school is like these days. But really, we didn't have to do anything about it because the budget was very small. So we were using a real school. The camera people were there at school opening, school closing time. And, you know, these redheaded kids came out, these black kids came out, these Asian kids came out, and their parents were waiting for them. So we had what we wanted without actually having to script it, if that makes sense.
That does, yeah.
And I suppose my worry would be, I suppose you could call it tokenism.
Sure.
But Rosie's best friend, for example, is a black woman. And that wasn't scripted, but it made as much sense as a dream. You know, it's Dublin, for example. There's a sizable immigrant population and the children of immigrants. And so it's there. And it's going to be reflected in the writing of younger writers, you know, because a lot of, say, I have read the work of young people who would be going home to a house where it's Polish is being spoken. So that grammar is bubbling under their English, and you can see it in the way they're writing, you know.
Yeah.
So quite exciting. That notion of what Irish writing is all about is, in a way, up for grabs, which strikes me as being a very, very healthy thing. But yeah, it is a different place to the place it was when I started writing, you know. Very, very different, but I've been aware of that.
Sure. That I'm going to ask a question now. and then I'll ask one more from our virtual audience. But I'm really I was really interested to learn more about your organization in Dublin called Fighting Words. Partly because many of our listeners and viewers in Philadelphia will be familiar with Mighty Writers, which is Philadelphia's sort of I won't say version of it, but it's an organization that gives sort of time and space to young writers after school and uses creative writing as a platform for sort of self-expression and also academic success. Will you tell people about? Oh, am I still here? I froze. It looks like I froze for a second, but I'm still here. Okay. I'd love for you to have the opportunity to just tell people a little bit about Fighting Words, because I was really moved by what I heard.
Well, Fighting Words, I co-founded it in 2009, whatever, 11 years ago.
Yeah.
Whatever that year is called. Was it 29 or 2009? I don't know. I never quite got the hang of the first decade of the century. But we're located on the north side of Dublin, but we actually have centres throughout the island, in Belfast, in Cork, Galway. I can't remember how many centres we have now. But the whole idea was to make creative writing as inviting and as enjoyable as possible to children and to teenagers, and to get rid of the classroom, so to speak, and the compunction, and to allow children to write what they wanted to write. And it's been great. This afternoon I proofread a gang of stories by these little kids we've been doing a lot of work online and a lot of projects, and all these kids have been writing stories that are inspired by the lighthouses around Ireland, and they're wonderful. They're really, really great. And what we try to do then is, with the cooperation of schools, the problem with the school system here is that it's all bells, it's all timing, and it's all geared towards one final exam, what children do, called the Leaving Cert, when they're 18, and it's the make or break moment. You either go that way towards success or over there, and it's been like that since the foundation of the state. And it's all built around rote learning, and it's all built around exams. And if you're not feeling particularly energetic for the 2.5 hours in the afternoon, June, whenever you do the exam, tough.
Yeah.
So, writing creatively is actually actively discouraged at times if it's an option on the exam paper, because it's difficult to correct, as they call it. So my daughter, for example, was told not to write the short story option, to write an argumentative essay instead, which seems almost perverse.
Right.
So anyway, we set up this place, and it's been great. It's been really, really great. And also it brings me into contact with elements of life that perhaps, I used to be a high school teacher, but I stopped that 27 years ago. So it gives me this contact with young people. Sure. But also, as I said earlier, I'm reading and encountering work which is so wild in a way, which really, if you like, cracks the grammar and puts it together again in a different way. That it's really quite exciting. It's really good.
That's
really
great.
Yeah.
All right, Roddy, here's your final question from the audience and from me, and then I want to say something at the end. But final question is, this is funny, from Ben. I read that the New York Times printed the word gobshite for the first time today in an excerpt they ran from Love. You've broken down a wall. How does that feel?
I'm going to be cursed with this one now for years. Yeah, I keep getting texts,
Yep.
I find it strange. It's great. I mean, it's nice, isn't it? Because it happened yesterday, which was publication day. So which in a way was a bit of a non-event, because here I am in Dublin and the book's coming out in the United States and I'm, you know, thousands of miles away. But I got, somebody texted me, and because I do read the New York Times, but I don't get any of these alerts. And I certainly wouldn't have thought gobshite that I was going to be responsible for putting the word gobshite into the New York Times.
You're a pioneer.
Yeah, so it's early on in the novel. It's the line is he's a gobshite, by the way, or a gobshite, by the way, and so yeah, it's a nice way of marking the occasion. But I know that I'm going to be asked a question now for the, and my father actually would have been delighted, because he was a major and very, very articulate exponent of the word gobshite.
That's great. Well, thank you so much for talking to us. This is not the cover that you should look for, but it's I like this cover. That's the cover, yep. And it's just a wonderful book. It was a gift to read, partly because, you know, I just feel the more I write, the fewer books kind of surprise me and move me in terms of the directions they take. And every direction this book took felt surprising and also inevitable. And by the end, I was extremely moved. And yeah, I felt some real emotions that I hadn't felt for a long time. And I've read your other work as well. And I think this is really a remarkable part of a really amazing legacy. So thank you for letting me interview you, and thanks to the Free Library for having us. Good luck with your virtual tour.
Thanks very much.